Now, we left off with this Constitution being full of all of these compromises. So you could get big states, small states, you could get slave owners, non slave owners to all agree. But what happens when it's all done? It doesn't go right into effect. And in fact, since they'd only gone there in theory to revise the Articles of Confederation, many people were quite surprised when people came out of this very secret time in Philadelphia and they're like, yeah, we've got something new. Okay. So the decision that was made was that they would have to get approval from 9 out of the 13 states, but they weren't going to get it from directly the people, and they weren't going to get it from the state congresses. They were going to have specific state conventions where, again, they had to have more than, 2/3, or I don't even know if that's 2/3, 9 out of 13. Again, math's not so good. But you had two sort of factions that emerged. And again, these are not political parties. I want you to understand that. Factions had emerged in the past. They're really groups that come together sort of temporarily for a purpose, and then in theory, they're going to disband. So you have the Federalists, and these are the people that are in favor of this new federal constitution. And these people are led by some of the great minds from the actual Constitutional Convention, people like Hamilton and Madison, and they had a very concrete proposal, which was we need something new. Um, we need to get rid of the old system that wasn't working, that gave power to the mob. We want something that really can create a stable, functioning country. These people tended to be younger, more energetic, they were more organized, more unified, and frankly, again, they had some really brilliant people on their side. It's impossible to overstate what Madison's role is, both first as a Federalist, and then later he's going to really jump to the other side. But Hamilton will always stay very much a Federalist. Now then you've got the anti-Federalists. You've got an unfortunate name. Again, you got sort of the yes and the no, but anti-Federalist doesn't really have that great of a ring to it. Their concern, of course, was that this new central government will be comprised of aristocrats who would abuse the people. They said, the common man will have really lost his voice. Why did we fight against the British from 1776 to 1783, then to quickly 4 years after the end of the Treaty of Paris, go back to something that feels monarchical? So the big thing that they felt they lacked in the Constitution was, specific protections for the people. And we're going to later see the Anti-Federalists almost demanding, we need a Bill of Rights. And again, states had bills of rights. So they actually had that concept that was out there. Now, there's going to be propaganda in every state. You've got your Federalists who say, we need this, let's ratify it. You've got your Anti-Federalists who are like, listen, either we should stick with the Articles of Confederation or come up with something different, but certainly not this new Constitution. And, at the end of the day, unfortunately, Delaware was the first state to ratify. But let's move past that because that's irrelevant. But you had the big states, and one of the biggest states was New York. And even if everybody did ratify, you still needed the big states like New York and Virginia, because if they didn't ratify and everyone else did, it wouldn't really be that legitimate since they were really so powerful overall. And there was some real debate in New York about whether, you should go for this or not. So you have these brilliant minds. You got Hamilton, you got Madison, and you've got another great leader, John Jay, who write what are known as the Federalist Papers. Now, these are a ton of propaganda trying to get New Yorkers to understand that a strong central government is best for them. Now, Madison famously wrote something called the Federalist Number 10. It's a little bit complicated, but the main idea was he tried to flip the script and tried to make sure that people understood that the prevailing wisdom that a republic, again, a representative democracy, would only work in a small country. That was the thinking, okay? But he said, no, 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 no. Actually, the only way that a republic really works is a large republic, because what you're going to have is you're going to have a bunch of little groups that emerge that are going to check each other. No one can have too much power. So again, he took this whole idea of a republic has to be small and said actually a republic would actually be best if it were large. And in the end, New York does actually go for the Constitution, which is important. Okay. Now, again, in most of these states where there was a debate, The way that the Federalists got the Anti-Federalists on board was to say, we're going to give you a Bill of Rights. Now, there was some real risk there because states could only say yes or no. They couldn't say yes and. So they had to, on faith, take the Federalists at their word that says when we have the first Congress that meets, we will actually amend the Constitution, which they ultimately did, but there was really no guarantee. Now, once you actually, have a Constitution ratified and you're ready to have your government, again, going all the way back, you get your three branches, all of that, okay, checks and balances and the like, pretty quickly it became clear that there were two parties emerging. Now, George Washington, in his famous inaugural address, had pretty much warned against that. He didn't specifically say it, but he's like, we need unity. We need to be, really a national government, something that represents all people. Can't we get along? But very quickly, it was obvious that he had two people right there in his cabinet, his advisors, that really were sort of leading their respective parties. Now, what you're going to have is for the Secretary of State, and that's really dealing with issues abroad, you have Thomas Jefferson. Then for his Treasury Department, the Secretary of the Treasury, he's got Alexander Hamilton. So these guys become the heads, the unofficial heads of two different political parties. Thomas Jefferson is going to lead what are known as the Democratic Republicans, not Democrat Republicans, Democratic Republicans, sometimes known as the Jeffersonian Republicans. These were, these were the defenders of the common man. They had come really out of the anti-federalist movement faction. They're pro-farmer. They're distrust this big central government. They defend states' rights. And they're ultimately, we're going to see later on, more explanation, they believe in a strict interpretation of the Constitution, which basically says you got to read the Constitution. If it's not in the Constitution, that power belongs to the states, they said. So they were literalists in that regard. The Federalists are led by Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. Now, again, John Adams is the vice president because he got the second most electoral votes. That policy will change a few elections later. Interestingly, you don't hear me say the name James Madison. James Madison had gone from being a Federalist when they were trying to get the Constitution ratified to basically leaving and joining Jefferson and becoming a Democratic Republican. So he both is going to be really the author of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which is really the protections against this strong central government. So he's really a fascinating guy. But on the Federalist side, remember they were a faction before, they're a party now. These are sort of your Northeasterners, your New York, your Boston. These people believe in commerce and growth, and they're concerned about the common man, and they want a strong central government. And they're going to be what we call believers in the loose interpretation of the Constitution. Again, we'll talk about that more next chapter in 6C, but what it essentially means is they believe in the spirit of the Constitution. If there's things that you need to do that maybe aren't in there, using what we call the necessary and proper clause, then that's okay. All right? So as we move along, it's important to realize that the Federalists had said, we promise a Bill of Rights. And in fact, there was a Bill of Rights that was agreed to in the first Congress. Now, actually, the way that a Bill of Rights works is an amendment. In this case, it was 10 amendments to the Constitution. And amendments have to first be approved by Congress. So it has to be approved by 2/3 of the House and the Senate. And then it has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. Now, the first 10 amendments are stuff that you've probably heard of. First Amendment is what we know as RAPS, and that's religion, assembly, press, petition, and speech. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. Third Amendment is about quartering, means you don't have to be forced to have soldiers in your home. The Fourth Amendment is protection from illegal search and seizure. The Fifth Amendment is basically your right to not incriminate yourself. The Sixth Amendment and Seventh Amendment deal with the right to an attorney, to a quick, speedy trial, to a jury of your peers. The Eighth Amendment refers to protection from cruel and unusual punishment. The Ninth Amendment is too complicated to even describe. And the 10th Amendment, very, very important to people like Thomas Jefferson, the Democratic Republicans, and in fact, Republicans today in 2018. And the idea is that if it's not in the Constitution specifically, those powers belong to the states. That's why it's known as the reserved powers, namely those powers are reserved for the states. And now, the Bill of Rights is supposed to protect the common man from the power of the central government, but really it only protected property owning white males. Slaves not protected. Native Americans not protected. Women not really protected because they can't vote yet, and they won't be able to vote really until the early 20th century. And we're going to talk much more later on, but frankly, the Bill of Rights only referred to federal crimes, so it won't even refer to states. We're going to see that much later. But we want to focus specifically on religion, because remember, religion was a reason that people had come to the colonies way back when, be it to Plymouth, be it to Mass Bay, obviously to Maryland, also to Pennsylvania with the Quakers. And the First Amendment is very interesting. It's got two parts for freedom of religion. One is the Establishment Clause, which means the federal government may not establish any official religion. The other part is the Free Exercise Clause, which means you can worship however you want. The government cannot tell you how to worship. This is really important because it sets up this separation of church and state, that the government and religion cannot be, one and the same. Obviously, we saw a quasi-theocracy in Mass Bay. You're not going to have it here under this new government, which is very different than other countries around the world.